Years ago, my mother passed away, and I had to attend her funeral with my children and husband. I say had to because I hadn't had contact with her for a long time. We didn't get along well. She had a very strong temper, always strict with my sister and me. She never hit us, but her words were harsh when something didn't go her way, or when we didn't do what she said. I don't remember her ever showing us even a bit of affection, but that wasn't the main reason I distanced myself from her. It was because over time she began to associate with strange people. People involved in weird cults, doing all kinds of rituals. This made our already tense relationship even worse. She became colder and more distant. And in the house where we lived with her, strange things started happening. We would hear weird noises in the middle of the night, and even see shadows walking around the house with our own eyes. I decided to move out with my husband, and my sister eventually left as well. As I said, I didn't have contact with her after that, because I didn't want my children to be around the bad energy my mother had brought into her own home. This is where my story begins. When my mother died, my sister called to tell me the news, saying her body was already at the funeral home and we had to go to complete the paperwork for the wake. We arrived at the place. It was on February. I remember it clearly because it was freezing. It was snowing and it was very dark, making the atmosphere already depressing and eerie. The first thing they told us was that my mother had been dead for 2 days when they found her. A friend of hers visited and realized she was lifeless on her living room sofa. The cause of death, according to the forensics team, was a heart attack. I started filling out all the forms for the wake, and my sister left because she had a newborn baby and couldn't stay long. I stayed at the funeral home preparing everything. I remember being completely alone in the reception area filling out paperwork, when I clearly heard my mother's voice calling my name. I froze, staying silent to see if I would hear it again or if it was just my imagination. But then, once again, I heard my mother's voice calling. "Sophia, I'm here." I got up from my seat and walked down a long hallway where the voice had come from. The hallway was long and narrow with several rooms on both sides. Some doors were open and I could see rooms filled with coffins of all kinds. Then I heard her voice again, calling me from the end of the hallway. I was terrified. Don't ask me why I followed the voice. Maybe I wanted to confirm that my mother was truly dead, or if it was really her speaking to me. I kept going until I reached a room where a sign clearly said, "Staff only." It was the last room, and the light was off because I couldn't see anything through the small window on the door. My intuition told me to open the door. I turned on the flashlight on my phone, and there she was. My mother lying on a stretcher, naked with her eyes open. I was shocked to see her like that. I had never seen a dead body before, let alone imagine seeing my mother like that. Honestly, I was also scared because that's where her voice had come from, calling me. At that moment, I turned my phone around to look for the light switch, and in the second I turned, I heard the stretcher creak where my mother was. I quickly shone the flashlight back at her, and there she was, sitting up on the stretcher staring at me. There was no expression on her face, just sitting there looking at me. I slowly backed out of the room. Once I was out, I ran, almost crying from fear. When I reached the reception area, I bumped into the receptionist. She asked, "Is everything okay?" I was still crying, unable to say a word. She helped me sit down and tried to calm me. I didn't tell her anything about what I had seen or heard because I knew I would sound crazy and she wouldn't believe me. I would only get in trouble for entering a room that clearly said "staff only." I just told her I felt bad about my mother's death, that I had finished all the paperwork, and that I was leaving. I got home in a state of shock. I didn't tell my husband anything, much less my children. I didn't want to alarm them, and I knew it was hard to believe. That night I couldn't sleep. The image of my dead mother staring at me and calling me in that dark room haunted me. The next day we arrived at the funeral home early, as they had my mother ready in the coffin to begin. It was still empty. None of my mother's friends or family had arrived yet since the official wake started at 9 a.m., and it was only 7. I went with my husband to pay for the funeral services and left my children sitting in the room with their grandmother. Then I saw my eldest son outside on his phone. I went out and asked him why he had left his sister alone. Responded that he was talking to his girlfriend, and that nothing would happen to her for being alone for a bit. I quickly went to get her because I didn't want her to be alone there. When I entered the room, my daughter was leaning on the coffin, talking, laughing by herself. I approached her and said, "Danny, come here, what are you doing?" She responded with something that chilled me. She said, "Grandma doesn't want me to leave. We're talking." I quickly went to check my mother's corpse. Her eyes were closed, dead. I stayed silent, trying to process what my daughter had just told me. I grabbed at her arm and took her away from there. She struggled, trying to get back to my mother, saying that her grandmother didn't want her to leave, and that I should let her go back to her. I got angry and said, "Your grandmother is dead, stop lying." My daughter ran out crying to her father. My husband picked her up and asked what was wrong. She told him the same thing, that I wouldn't let her be with her grandmother, that she wanted to keep talking to her. My husband looked at me, calmed our daughter down to stop her from crying, and took her to buy some candy at a store across the street. My son was still outside on his phone. I went back into the room and started praying. I prayed for my mother to find the light and rest in peace, so she wouldn't become a lost soul, as I believe she had. While I was praying, the candles around her coffin suddenly went out. It was strange because there wasn't even a draft in that room. Then the power went out entirely, plunging the room into complete darkness, as there were no windows to let in natural light. I had left my phone charging in the lobby, and I began to feel chills all over my body. I ran to the door to leave the room, but somehow it was jammed. I couldn't get out. I knocked several times for someone to open it, but no one heard me. There was hardly any staff at that time, and my son was still outside. I was desperate, screaming, when I felt something touch my shoulder. I wanted to faint, but I managed to turn my head despite the fear that gripped every inch of my body. It was her. It was my mother's body speaking to me, telling me she would return for my daughter because she no longer belonged to me, that she had given her to the devil. I collapsed on the floor, unconscious. I don't know what happened after that until I woke up in a hospital. I opened my eyes, and my husband and sister were there. They told me they had found me passed out in the room and had taken me to the hospital in an emergency. The first thing I asked in a panic was, "Where's my daughter?" They told me she was still at the funeral home with her brother and my sister's husband. I ripped off everything they had attached to me and ran out of the hospital room. My husband yelled at me to wait, that I was still on supervision and that our children were fine. But I knew they weren't safe in that funeral home with my mother's corpse. I got into the car, and my husband and sister barely managed to get in before I sped off. I ran into the funeral home shouting for my daughter Daniela. The first person I saw was my son. I asked him, "Where's your sister?" He replied that she was in the bathroom and asked what was wrong. I ran to the bathroom, but my daughter wasn't there. I came out desperate, asking where she was, scolding my son for not watching her. He said, "Mom, I swear she went into the bathroom and I haven't seen her come out." We all started searching for her. By that time, people were arriving for the funeral. All I could think about was finding my daughter. I asked the staff for help and we all began searching. But there was one place I hadn't checked. My mother's coffin. I approached slowly and my mother was gone. My mother was no longer in her coffin. I told my husband what was happening and alerted the funeral home workers. They said it was impossible. No one could have moved the body, and there was no way to miss someone taking it since the reception was right at the entrance. I was losing my mind, screaming for them to find my daughter, but they couldn't find her anywhere. A few minutes later, someone knocked on the door of the room where the funeral was taking place. I opened the door myself. My daughter Daniela was standing there with the same strange look I had seen on my mother's face earlier. She didn't say a word. She just walked over and lay down in my mother's coffin, closing her eyes. To this day, I don't know what happened, but my daughter is no longer the same. I'm afraid that something evil that is no longer my mother came to possess my little girl, for the pact with the devil my mom did. After many visits with the father at the church, I hope everything improves. Thank you, Glenn, for sharing my story. I worked at the front desk of a funeral home. I hadn't been there long, and no, of course it wasn't my ideal job. But I had been struggling to find something with decent pay since I was a university student, and needed to pay for my studies. My job involved attending to people who came in to ask about the prices of coffins and funeral services. I also had to make sure that the number of people attending the wakes didn't exceed the allowed limit. Overall, I was there for customer service. One day, a funeral was about to start. There were very few people in the wake room when suddenly a well-dressed man in a suit walked in. He looked very elegant but somewhat disoriented. I asked him if I could help him with anything. He asked me what place this was. I told him it was San Carlos Funeral Home and asked if he was there to attend the funeral that was about to start. He said no, that he didn't know how he had ended up there and that maybe he was confused. Then he left. I continued with my work, answering calls and helping people as they arrived. Several hours passed, and it was getting dark. I got up to grab a coffee when I saw, through the window facing the other wake room, the same man sitting in one of the chairs. He was completely alone, as that room was supposed to be closed since there were no services there that day. I found it strange that he was there, as the rooms are locked when not in use. So I left the reception area and approached the room. I tried to open the door, but it was locked. I knocked, hoping the man would hear me and open the door so I could tell him he wasn't allowed to be in there and needed to leave. But the man never turned to look at me. He just kept sitting there, staring ahead where the coffins usually are. I immediately went to find the security guard to tell him what was happening and asked him to unlock the door so we could escort the man out. He told me that no one could be in there since that room hadn't been opened since the day before after it was cleaned. Only he and the owner had keys, and the owner hadn't come in that day. It seemed strange to us, but when we arrived at the room, the man was no longer there. The guard opened the door and we searched, but there was no one. He asked if I was sure I had seen someone there. I told him yes, that I wasn't crazy, and that the same man had come to the reception earlier that day and spoken with me. The guard just locked the door again and returned to his post. I went back to reception, feeling very confused about what had happened. It was almost time for me to leave, so I entered the room where the wake was being held to check that everything was in order before going home. When I walked into the room, I saw a photo of that man, the man who had spoken with me earlier in the day. His picture was next to the coffin because he was the one being mourned. I ran out of there, terrified and unable to believe it. A coworker ran into me at the entrance and asked if I was okay. Through tears, I explained what had happened to me, telling him he had every right not to believe me. If someone had told me this story, I probably wouldn't have believed it either. But instead of making me feel crazy, he said he did believe me and understood. He had been working there longer and told me that he too had seen things at that place many times. He told me not to be afraid, that it was understandable to be shocked since no one is used to seeing, much less talking, to the dead. But he assured me they were just restless souls who didn't yet realize they had passed away, trapped in a sort of limbo, and that they would likely cross over soon. He said they were just transient souls who wouldn't harm me. I went home that day, feeling a strong urge to quit, but I couldn't because I needed the money to continue studying. I asked my boss if I could take the day off and she agreed. But after that, I had to go back to work and pretend nothing had happened. I stayed there for another 3 months, and during that time, strange things would happen occasionally. I would sometimes see shadows when the funeral home was empty. I got used to it all until I finally found a better job and was able to quit. I hope you liked my story, and just remember, if you too have ever seen or spoken with the dead, know that you're not alone. There are others who have experienced this, especially those of us who are more sensitive. If you are enjoying it, I would greatly appreciate your like and subscription. Let's continue. Good evening, my name is George, and I work at a funeral home as a mortician. My job is to prepare the bodies so that their families can hold a wake for them. We disinfect, embalm, and make the bodies aesthetically presentable. I want to emphasize that this job is not for everyone, as you need to be very psychologically prepared for this work. Even after all my years of experience, it's still difficult sometimes. Many of the bodies that arrive have tragic stories. The last seconds of their lives were terrifying. Sometimes we have to make their bodies look as presentable as possible, which often means sewing limbs or repairing disfigured faces. I usually work alone, but about a month ago, a medical student joined as an intern and became my assistant. He made my job a bit easier, and it felt good to have someone around. One night, we were embalming the body of an elderly man who had died of a heart attack. It was a typical night when suddenly another body arrived from the morgue, ready to be prepared. We placed it in the room upstairs while we finished with the old man. Apparently, it was the body of a motorcyclist who had died after being hit by a car, and he was in terrible condition. I knew it would take us all night to work on him, so we hurried. We were about to finish with the elderly man when we heard footsteps upstairs. It seemed strange because the funeral home was empty that night. There were no funerals, and the staff wouldn't arrive until the morning. The only body upstairs was that of the motorcyclist who had just arrived. To be honest, I didn't think much of it since all I wanted was to finish quickly so we could move on to the next body. However, the young man helping me got a little nervous. I told him, "Relax, kid, it's nothing. This is just part of the job." We continued, but not 2 minutes later the footsteps started again, this time on the stairs, getting louder and louder. I thought someone might have broken in, though it was impossible because everything was locked. I told the young man, "Wait here, I'll go check." I left the room, went up the stairs, and turned on the lights in the room where the motorcyclist's body was, but no one was there. It was completely silent. As I was coming back downstairs, I noticed a teddy bear lying on the floor. That seemed odd since the bear hadn't been there earlier when we arrived. The only explanation I could think of was that it belonged to a child who had attended a funeral the day before, and had accidentally left it behind. Still, I couldn't figure out how it ended up at the entrance of the rooms where we prepare the bodies, as access is restricted to employees only. I picked it up and placed it on a table, intending to hand it over to the receptionist the next day in case someone came looking for it. We finished with the elderly man and went upstairs to retrieve the motorcyclist's body. We were both shocked to see the condition he was in. We started working on him, and I sent my assistant to another room to get some tools we needed. In those few moments, I took out my phone to check it, turning my back to the corpse. Then I heard a murmur that made my skin crawl. I clearly heard someone whisper in my ear, "Give it to her." I dropped my phone and quickly turned around, but no one was there. When I looked at the motorcyclist's body, I saw that his head had turned towards the table where I had left the teddy bear, and what terrified me the most was that his eyes were open, staring in the direction of the bear. I shouted for my assistant because, to be honest, I was terrified. Nothing like this had ever happened to me before. I told the young man what had happened, and he also saw how the body's eyes were open, but it was impossible. The man had been dead for over 24 hours. We couldn't explain how his head had turned and his eyes had opened. But more than that, I knew he was the one who had whispered in my ear. I was completely certain, although I didn't immediately understand what he meant by "give it to her." The next day, when his family arrived for the wake, I was just about to leave for home as my shift had ended. Suddenly, the funeral home owner came running after me, in the parking lot, asking me about a teddy bear that the deceased wife insisted had been in the backpack he was carrying when he died. When they gave her his belongings, the bear was missing. She knew her husband had the bear because, just minutes before he died, he had sent her a photo of it, the bear he had bought for their little daughter who was about to graduate from kindergarten. But now the bear was gone. When I heard that, everything made sense to me. I couldn't stop my eyes from filling with tears. I took the owner to where I had found the bear and explained everything that had happened that night. She looked at me in astonishment without saying a word. She simply touched my shoulder and said, "Thank you, I'll give it to his wife." I was friends with the security guard, so I asked him to show me the footage from the previous night, just to make sure no one had entered to leave the bear or something. Honestly, I just wanted to find a logical explanation. When we reviewed the footage after we had placed the motorcyclist's body in the upstairs room, we saw a black shadow leave that room, descend the stairs, and disappear on the first floor. There was no doubt. The footsteps we heard, the voice that whispered to me, and the shadow we saw in the footage. It was the motorcyclist. A lost soul who just wanted to deliver the teddy bear to his daughter. It's a story that left a lasting mark on me, and no matter how many years go by, I'll always remember it. Good evening, Glenn. My name is Hector, and a few years ago I worked as a janitor at a funeral home. It took me a while to get used to the job, as you're always surrounded by the deceased and grieving families, and the overall atmosphere is depressing. You need to have a strong mind for this type of work. One night, the body of a 5-year-old girl arrived. I knew because I was asked, along with another worker, to carry the small coffin to the room where the bodies are prepared. It felt awful because I had a young daughter myself, but I focused on doing my job and not getting emotionally involved, as you need to stay detached in this line of work. That night, I stayed behind to clean the funeral home as usual, and set up the room where the girl's wake would take place the next day. No one was there except for the woman who prepared the bodies and me. It was almost 11 p.m., and I needed to hurry because I had to get home to my wife and daughter. While cleaning the bathrooms, I heard footsteps entering. I was inside a bathroom, so I didn't see who it was, but I assumed it was the woman who prepared the bodies since she was the only one there. I said, "Are you coming in? Let me step out." I left the bathroom I was cleaning, but there was no one there. I checked under the stalls, and in the last stall, I saw the feet of a little girl wearing shoes and socks. I didn't say anything. I just walked out of the bathroom and went to where the woman was preparing the body of the girl. I knocked on the door and asked if she could come out for a moment. She immediately came out and asked if I needed something. I asked if she had a daughter with her at the funeral home, or if she knew who the little girl in the women's bathroom was. She looked at me in shock and said she didn't have children, and that no one else was in the funeral home. Everyone had left about an hour ago, and it was just the two of us. She asked if I was sure I had seen someone in the bathroom. I told her yes, that I was absolutely certain it was a little girl. She said, "Let's go check." So we went to the women's bathroom, and I pointed out the stall where I had seen her. The woman opened the door, but no one was there. The bathroom was empty. We searched the funeral home to see if we could find her, but we didn't see anyone. The woman still had work to do, so she told me, "If you see anything, call me." She went back to her work, and I returned to mine, but I couldn't stop thinking about what I had seen. I was so sure it had been real. The woman finished her work and told me she was heading home. She said, "See you tomorrow, Mr. Hector. Don't stay too long, you need to rest." I took that as her doubting what I had seen, maybe thinking I was just tired. I replied, "Good night. Take care." I headed to the small room where they hold the wakes to clean it, as it was the last task I had before heading home. Everything was going normally until I heard the sound of a small child crying. I left the room to listen more closely. The crying was coming from the room where they placed the bodies in coffins, waiting for their wake. I slowly approached and said, "Hello?" But there was no response. I was scared, to be honest, but I couldn't get the image of those little girls' feet in the bathroom out of my head. Now I was hearing crying, and I feared finding out what was happening. I got closer to the room, opened the door, and the crying stopped. It was completely silent in there. The only coffin in the room was the one with the girl who had arrived that night, already closed with her inside. I closed the door to leave, and immediately the crying started again. It was heartbreaking, anguished, and there was no doubt it was coming from that room. I didn't dare open that door again because I knew that the crying I was hearing came from that deceased little girl. I was also sure that the girl I had seen in the bathroom that night was her as well. I slowly walked out, gathered my things, and locked up the funeral home. I felt deep sadness on my way home, as I couldn't stop thinking about that little girl. The next day I went back to work. They were holding the wake for the girl, and her parents were by her side, crying. When it was time to take her to the cemetery, I overheard her mother asking to go with her, saying that her little girl had always been terrified of the dark, that she never liked being alone at night. The hearse driver let her ride in the passenger seat, and they all left together. That's when I understood that the little girl hadn't wanted me to leave that night. She didn't want to be alone in the dark, and that's why she cried so desperately. I was deeply affected by that experience, so my wife spoke with me and suggested I quit, telling me it wasn't worth it, especially since I was having trouble sleeping after that night. A week later I quit my job, but even now I still remember that little girl, crying so that I wouldn't leave her alone in the dark. Thanks, Glenn, for sharing my story.